Welcome back to This Week in Immigration. I'm your host, Hanadi Jordan, Communications Associate at the Bipartisan Policy Center. This week, as a nod to Valentine's Day, we're going to talk about marriage in the context of immigration, the challenges the existing immigration system has created for couples and families, and some of the myths around immigration and marriage. Joining us today is This Week regular Teresa Cardinal-Brown, along with Tran Dang, founder and executive director of the Rhizome Center for Migrants, Tony Payan, director of the Center for the United States and Mexico at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy, and Jeremy McKinney, president of the American Immigration Lawyers Association. We've got a lovely episode for you today, so stick around. Welcome back. To start off this episode, we welcome Tran Dang, founder and executive director of the Rhizome Center for Migrants, and Tony Payan, director of the Center for the United States and Mexico at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. Tran and Tony, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
I'd like to start us off firstly by hearing a little bit from both of you about some of the work that you do. So Tran, can you talk a little bit about the Rhizome Center, your mission, and the work that you do there?
Sure. So the Rhizome Center for Migrants was founded in 2018. And I'll rewind a little bit further to 2016 to provide some background information on what was happening at the time and why the Rhizome Center for Migrants was founded. So back in 2016 is when I first came to Mexico. And at that time, President Trump was still campaigning for office. He made a lot of promises then that ultimately did a lot of harm to migrants and immigrants in the United States and also in the region. One of the first things he did as president was change the immigration enforcement priorities. So really making those in the interior of the United States much more vulnerable to deportation. And they're people who have been living in the United States for decades, in some cases, people who have been able to start families, businesses, and were fully entrenched in their communities. People who were long-term residents of the United States were suddenly targeted, people who had served the U.S. Army, people who had their cases administrative closed, suddenly saw those reopening and finding themselves in immigration court again, this time facing deportation. So being an American sort of on this side of the border, I was watching all of this and was very concerned about what was happening to people who were coming back to Mexico in this type of situation. I ultimately decided to found the Rhizome Center for Migrants to help those who, were living binational lives and were now having a lot of trouble assimilating in Mexico, and also those whose binational experience created a situation of precarity in Mexico where they were unable to access their basic rights. Last year, in 2022, I had the opportunity to collaborate with the Baker Institute for Public Policy at Rice University to provide a report on the situation of displaced Americans, so the children and spouses of Mexican migrants who were being co-deported with their loved ones and were also finding themselves in a situation of serious vulnerability.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Tran. Tony, can you tell us a little bit about your work at the Baker Institute?
Sure. Some 10 years ago, I came to Rice University, invited to work on an immigration project, actually. It was a small project. It was supposed to last 6 months. And then over time, we developed it into this Center for the United States and Mexico. And one of the interesting things about the Baker Institute is that it didn't have an agenda on immigration, which was one of the issues that I researched actively while I was at the University of Texas at El Paso. And so I took it on. I sort of imported that agenda on immigration into the Baker Institute. And ever since, for the last 10 years, we've been working, my team and myself, on issues of immigration. We obviously look at the entire U.S.-Mexico relationship. We look at issues of trade, organized crime, the rule of law, border governance, natural resources, and there's all kinds of issues that we work on. But immigration is one of them, and I think it's a key, not just because there's a number of Mexicans and Mexican Americans who live in the United States. We're talking about close to 40 million people of Mexican descent who live in the United States, but we're also talking about 1.2, 1.6, 1.3, who knows how many Americans live in Mexico. Many of them, of course, individuals that have taken their families as they're deported. And so I think Tran Dang and I found sort of a particular interest in that population that was being deported to Mexico, and then were taking with them a lot of these Americans. So we often think of Americans in Mexico as the retirees who live in Lake Chapala, who live in Mexico City, who live in San Miguel de Allende. But we often don't think about all those Americans, American citizens, American-born individuals who are deported with their families into Mexico. And they're much more spread throughout rural communities, semi-rural communities, many different cities. And those the State Department doesn't necessarily report on. They're aware of them, but they don't report on them. And so we found this kind of joint project that we hope we can continue in the future.
Thank you, Tony, for breaking that down. And the work that you just described with Tran is something that I want to get into next, because this podcast is about immigration and marriage, this episode. And you both wrote an op-ed in September in the Dallas Morning News titled, "An Outdated Immigration System is Deporting U.S. Citizens by Proxy." And you drew attention to the unknown number of U.S. citizens leaving with their deported loved ones. And this is an issue particularly for U.S. children whose parents face deportation. However, you also allude to another problem, which is that of the spouses of those being deported. So can you tell us firstly, what is proxy deportation, and how is this issue brought to your attention?
I'll describe the phenomenon, and then I'll let Tran talk about the specific conditions of this population and what they face when they're living in Mexico. Look, we know that we have an undocumented population in the United States that is around 10.5 to 11 million. We don't know what the numbers are now with all these asylum seekers entering the United States, but there is a population that's been here for a very long time. Many of them 10 years, 15 years, 20, 30 years. And many of them have established families in the United States. They have spouses who are U.S. citizens. They met somebody, they fell in love, they got married. Clearly, some of them can no longer attain legal status in the United States because their presence in the United States has made them unqualifiable for status in the United States. So this is what we call a mixed status house or household, where you have somebody who's a U.S. citizen or a U.S. permanent resident, but married to an undocumented, and they can't get them papers because their presence disqualifies them for that. And then, of course, they have children, and those children are born in the United States, and so they are U.S. citizens by birth. And so these families live together. They live in this particular condition, a mixed status household. And then every once in a while, ICE conducts a raid in some construction site, and they apprehend the father, or in some restaurant, and they apprehend the mother, or, these kind of raids. They used to occur quite a bit in the United States to capture this population and then put them in the deportation process. And of course, at that point, once one of the parental units is in line for deportation, the family faces a very difficult situation, right? We can all go, we can get separated. The deported parent leaves for Mexico, and then the rest of us stay here, and we try to kind of create a family connection at a distance. We know that that's very difficult to do for families. And so very often families choose to go together. And so there they go, the deported, undocumented resident of the United States, and the spouse who may be a U.S. citizen, and the children who are born in the United States, and then they have to create a life there. And that is kind of an interesting situation that is happening more and more because more and more people were being deported, as I think Tran just mentioned, particularly under the Trump administration. Under the Obama administration, Some of them could apply for DED, deferred deportation, and they could stay in the United States and then they could check in with ICE. But under the Trump administration and other administrations that are less tolerant to immigrants or the presence of undocumented immigrants, they simply just place them under deportation and send them back. And then the family has to make a choice. These are very tragic choices that they have to make, but many of them are making them. And Tran has direct contact with these with people on the ground in Mexico.
And can you tell us a little bit about your experience speaking with some of those people on the ground in Mexico and what reality looks like for them?
Sure. And just to add a little bit to what Tony mentioned as well, immigration in the United States is extremely complex, and there's a lot of history there, much of which is based in gender and racial bias. There are reasons why things are the way that they are that I think the average American without context may not understand. And I think that one lens that really helps explain just how unjust and how far from American values our immigration policies are today is the impact that our immigration policies, and particularly our immigration enforcement policies and laws, have had on ordinary Americans. I mean, every day in the United States, immigration judges issue hundreds of deportations without considering the needs of U.S. citizens who don't have standing in immigration court. They can't argue for their fundamental rights, their right to family, their right to family life, or to live together as a family in the United States. And these rights are being violated every day. Here in Mexico, we are seeing an extraordinary number of Americans who are now here because of return or deportation. In the last 15 years, we've seen more than 4 million Mexicans deported from the United States. And with them, as Tony mentioned, in some cases, the families are choosing, but not choosing in a way, because they're being forced to choose between their country and their marriages or their families. But you are seeing an equally significant number of Americans emigrating to Mexico under these conditions. They are not like expats. They're not coming with wealth or resources. They're not being recruited for specific jobs in Mexico, but really sort of landing here and trying to figure out how they're going to manage and how they're going to survive. In some cases, in many cases, the U.S. citizen spouses who are coming don't speak Spanish, and they may not have the proper documentation, or their documentation may not be accepted in Mexico as proof of their familial relationships. So again, as Tony mentioned, the children of Mexican migrants are considered under the Mexican Constitution as Mexicans at birth and do have the ability to become dual citizens. The spouses of Mexican migrants also have or can naturalize through their familial relationships. But oftentimes when they're unable to prove those familial relationships because there's a perceived error in their marriage certificate. This can happen if the Mexican spouse doesn't use their full name. So it's pretty common in the United States to use just one last name. So if they're using one last name, then when they get to Mexico, Mexico doesn't accept this as the same identity. And this can be a huge issue for spouses who then have no pathway to legalize in Mexico. And if you're unable to legalize, that means you're not a legal person in Mexico. You are subject to immigration laws that may require you to leave the country every 6 months to keep your status. Because of the cost of doing that, a lot of spouses just simply don't and are living undocumented in Mexico. Being undocumented in Mexico is very much like being undocumented in the United States. You're living in the shadows. You don't have work authorization. You might be working under the table. You don't have the ability to fully integrate into society, which means you also don't have access to affordable health care, to government services, including daycare. You may not be able to continue your education, or in the situation of your kids, they may not be able to enroll in public school at all. So you do find Americans in extreme situations like this where they're really struggling to survive and really struggling to have any kind of life here.
Do we have an official count of the number of U.S. citizens who end up leaving with their spouses after they're deported?
We don't have exact numbers. The U.S. does not count the number of U.S. citizens who leave because of return or deportation. When we started seeing kind of more and more U.S. citizens on this side of the border, and particularly more and more U.S. citizens filling up Mexican classrooms, it caught the attention of Mexican academics. And so in the 1990s, you started seeing academics really trying to count this population to really understand the phenomenon that was happening. We do have numbers. I guess the most recent was from the intercensal 2015 intercensal data that basically use Mexican school administration data to count the number of U.S. citizens in K through 12 classrooms. And at that time, we know that there were over 550,000 U.S. kids enrolled in Mexican schools. We also know that there's a significant number of U.S. families living at the border where the kids are crossing every single day to attend school in the United States. So they're obviously not counted in this 550,000 number. Tony, I don't know if you have kind of better numbers, but I've seen these numbers estimated at 40,000, maybe even more. We just don't have reliable numbers there, but we do know that there's a significant population that's not being counted. We also know from the Mexican government that there are some 287,000 American children who don't have, quote, the proper documentation to enroll in school. So they're also not being counted in this 550,000 number. So without knowing kind of how many spouses are being affected, we do estimate, at least internally here at the Rising Center, that there are likely to be over 1 million U.S. citizens who are here because of return or deportation. And that's significant because the State Department estimates that the total U.S. population in Mexico today is 1.6 million. And so the number of Americans who are here because of return or deportation comprise a significant portion of that total population, and they're here under very specific circumstances with real needs that are not being met by either government.
I just want to add something about the border. I don't think we have the numbers. It's very difficult to estimate them, and especially but it's anecdotal. I mean, I travel to the U.S.-Mexico border very, very often, and I can tell you that every single morning there are long lines at every port of entry in the U.S. Entering the United States with backpacks, and they're children of all ages, and they're coming in from Juarez, and then you see them kind of milling around. Once they go through the checkpoint, they mill around, and then the bus comes and picks them up, or there's a van that comes around and picks them up, or many of them are using Uber and things like that. It's a situation that I think needs more attention. And my guess is that the 40,000 number is lowballed. I think there are many, many more tens of thousands of people. That's very convenient in some ways, because that way the family can stay together. If they settle in Juarez or in Tijuana or in Reynosa or someplace like that, they can still have a family life and then send the kids across. The kids have to provide a U.S. address, however, to be enrolled in the school district. And I've often wondered what address they're providing so that the school district can take them in as if they were residents of that school district and the families were paying taxes in that school district. And that's something that I think needs a little bit more research.
So we don't have any official count or concrete number of the number of U.S. citizens who are deported by proxy in Mexico. But there are groups, like you mentioned, Tran, like Intercel, which are tracking some of the U.S. children that are there. Are there any efforts maybe by the U.S. government to begin collecting this information?
There have been efforts in the past to encourage the United States government to count the number of Americans overseas. We're actually pushing for the Americans Abroad Caucus now to revisit that idea and to properly count Americans abroad in order to inform future programming and services around their specific needs here. In countries like Mexico, we're seeing a significant increase in the number of Americans who are here. But there is not, and I don't know, Tony, you're aware of any other efforts, but there is not an effort to properly count Americans abroad, sadly.
I think there is an effort. There's awareness at the U.S. Embassy and the various American consulates that there's this population and that they have to serve them and protect their rights and provide the documentation. Many of them come to the consulates to get their passports, their birth certificates and such. Those are services that consulates are supposed to provide, but they're insufficient. I think the U.S. has only a handful of consulates, and those consulates are thought through with tourists in mind. So you find them in Mexico City, you find them in Guadalajara, you find them in Cancun, you find them along the border, you find them with specific populations in mind. But I think barely now are they beginning to think that there might be a population they're not yet serving and they need to pay attention to. And think of it this way: Mexico has 50 or 51 consulates in the United States. Obviously, there are many more Mexicans in the United States, but the U.S. probably needs a few more consulates where more Americans are going to in the states of Michoacan, Guanajuato, Zacatecas, large sending states, immigrant sending states, that an American consulate is just simply too far. They have to make a trip to Mexico City or Guadalajara or Monterrey, someplace like that. So yeah, I think the U.S. is barely beginning to wake up to that.
Well, in your op-ed, another angle of the issue that you both write about is the sort of looming threat that proxy deportation presents, specifically in the sense of creating a potential underclass of workers and citizens. Can you describe what you mean by that and what the consequences of keeping this type of system in place are?
Look, Fran, in her study, the study that she conducted for the center, illustrated the case of, I think, a couple of siblings that landed in Houston, right? A 17-year-old or so, and his sibling, I think his name was Israel. In that particular case study, I think Fran used that as an illustration to sort of put the problem in perspective. And so they land in Houston. They have a U.S. passport, but they grew up in Mexico. I think the family had been deported in 2001 or something like that. And so here we are, 2018, 2019. The kid is now 17, 18. He wants to move to the United States. He is, for all practical purposes, a U.S. citizen with a passport in hand, but lacking all the cultural skills, lacking the language skills, lacking the social skills, lacking the ability to situate himself in the American society. And so he has to learn all those things all over again, and this time alone, without parents, without anyone, perhaps a relative who might be herself undocumented, and might get a job in construction, might get a job flipping burgers, the kinds of jobs that the undocumented, for example, might do, even though this is a U.S. citizen who probably could have had much more potential of contributing to the U.S. economy, the U.S. tax base, and be much more fully integrated. And because he has the right to be here, it's a right of return by virtue of birth, but in the prospects of a professional life, of social development, of integration into the American economy and such, the profile looks a lot more like that of an undocumented immigrant. And that is kind of an odd situation to be.
I think, unfortunately, Israel's case is not uncommon. There are hundreds of thousands of children now in Mexico who are becoming of age and making the decision to return to the United States. We know, based on research of children while they're still in school, that there is an intention to return to the United States one day. And why not? They have a U.S. passport. They have the ability to access economic opportunities, educational opportunities outside of Mexico. And many people do want to take advantage of that. And sadly, upon their return, after experiencing experiencing, in some cases, extreme difficulty here, gaining access to the school system, gaining access to health care, they return to the United States again in a vulnerable situation. And many are in need of the same types of services that are given to refugees. Unfortunately, they're American citizens, and they're not specific services or specific organizations in the United States who are looking out for them and who are in a situation to provide orientation services. One of the things that the Rhizome Center is involved in now is looking at what that reintegration process looks like and how they can prepare themselves to integrate into the local economy. So looking at organizations that do work with people who have gone through trauma in their lives or unexpected situations, people who are coming out of prison, really looking to build up their skills so they can start a life. And so we're in touch with Sarah Jobs right now about what a partnership or collaboration might look like. But you're looking at the number of American citizens in Mexico today, even if you're not talking about the children themselves and you're talking about the spouses. They came here not really wanting to leave the United States and really hoping for the opportunity to return home. Every U.S. spouse that I talked to who was affected by deportation would return to the United States tomorrow if they could with their family members. And some are patiently waiting out the 10-year bar. Maybe it's a permanent bar that they're not aware of, but they are awaiting the possibility to return home. And these are Americans who are coming to Mexico in their 30s and 40s. They'll be returning to the United States in their 50s and 60s without having been contributing to Social Security. And after having lost everything, paying for immigration attorney fees, losing their inheritances, losing all of their property and their homes, and returning to a situation where they don't have any of those things later in life. And they're having to possibly, need to reintegrate into a job market they don't recognize anymore. And so those are the type of situations that we're seeing. I think the United States can get ahead of this. In the report, I do include specific recommendations to the United States government about what can be done for American citizens while they're still here in Mexico to ensure that they are healthy, that they are being educated, and that they're being prepped to return to the United States one day. It also includes recommendations on what the United States can better do to ensure that their eventual reintegration into U.S. society can be a smoother one.
Tran, can you briefly discuss what some of those recommendations are?
Sure. So again, they were sort of divided into recommendations that were really around kind of what the U.S. government can do while the U.S. citizen is still in Mexico. So the report really pushes for better consular services. Tony mentioned earlier that the Mexican consulate system in the United States is expansive. There are over 50 consulates, one for each state. And that was there was a push to increase consular services and to protect the rights of Mexican citizens and those who are undocumented in the United States, and to provide know your rights training, legal resources, education opportunities, etc. And you saw the Mexican consulate doing this as the Mexican population in the United States continued to expand. What we're seeing in Mexico today is something similar. You're seeing a massive increase in the number of U.S. citizens who are here, who can't access schools, who can't access basic health care, who can't access government services. And we need the consulate to step in and to ensure that American citizens do have their proper documentation. Some of the specific recommendations we made included creating specific liaison positions between the Bureau of Consular Affairs and public health services here to ensure that Americans are getting access to health care. Liaison positions between the Consular Affairs Bureau and the Department of Education, and stepping in and ensuring that U.S. children have the ability to integrate into the Mexican school system. We recommend that the consular networks make visits. There's a huge part of the country that's considered unsafe to travel. And they're people, they're American citizens in Michoacan, in parts of Guanajuato, and other areas of the country where the U.S. consulate doesn't actually provide services. And so we're asking that, that they make it easier for Americans to access the services that they're entitled to and to do home visits to the places where American citizens are living, often in rural areas where, some don't have access to running water. And are living in extreme poverty. I think it's important to see how Americans are living in order to ensure that the services that are being provided and the information that's being requested of Americans are made in a way that is easy for people to comply with.
Thank you so much, Tran, for breaking that down. Tony, I just want to make sure you have a chance to jump in here with any policy solutions that you've heard that you think would help address some of this looming threat of a growing underclass of workers.
Yeah, I think that one thing that we have to be conscious about is these are American citizens. They deserve the same treatment and the same right as the tourists that go to Cancun, as the retirees that live in San Miguel de Allende, and they deserve the attention of the U.S. consulates and the same services that the U.S. consulate provides to the other Americans that are somehow legal or vacationing in Mexico. And we also know that in the Mexican consular network, there are some really good practices about providing healthcare services, about providing the kinds of IDs that people need to open a bank account, the kinds of documents that people need to enroll in school, and perhaps to get a little bit more I guess, a higher level of education in Mexico, and then sort of transfer that education when they return to the United States. These are not people that don't deserve those services, and I think we discount the value of their lives, mostly because they were born here, because their parents came without documents into the United States and such. No, they're American citizens, and I think they deserve that treatment. And I think the U.S. consular network in Mexico can certainly learn from the Mexican consular network in the United States, because they've done a great job at tending to those 12 million U.S. Mexican-born or Mexican citizens living in the United States, in addition to all the Mexican Americans who are often U.S. citizens. So that's a different population. So I think that really a dialogue between the two consular networks might be great, because there might be some real cross-learning between the two.
Well, as you both broke down, there's a ton of obstacles facing mixed status families, both the spouses of those deported and the U.S. children of those deported. Does the loss of these U.S. citizens via proxy deportation come with any economic costs to the U.S.? And if so, what are those costs?
There's been studies in the United States that show that undocumented immigrants are capped. And the glass ceiling that undocumented immigrants in the United States not only have to do with their undocumented status in the United States, they also have to do with the fact that they speak lower levels of English. It takes a long time to learn a foreign language. They have a lower degree of scholarization, or number of years that they've gone to schools, and they perhaps don't have the kinds of skills that a more modern, high-tech society requires. So you have that profile. These American citizens, U.S.-born kids who are raised in Mexico, are entering the United States with the same kinds of limitations that an undocumented worker would have: lower skills, lower levels of English proficiency, less cultural and capital, and a kind of a lesser ability to integrate themselves into the higher earning strata of the American society. They may climb over time because they're U.S. citizens. They may access scholarships, they may be able to apply to a university, but that takes a very long time. There's a process of socialization that they've lost. Most of us who have gone to school and somehow grew up in the United States, or went to school in the United States and adapted to the American life, we have a higher earning potential. these people are capped, even though they're American citizens. So obviously, their productivity level is probably going to be level. Their opportunities for employment are going to be lesser due to all these issues that I just mentioned. And of course, their contributions to the American economy and the tax base and such is going to be capped at some point. Some of them may break those glass ceilings that they come with. Even undocumented immigrants often do and open small businesses. So they may do it. But at the end of the day, there's no substitute for a well-educated, highly contributing member citizen of a society that can climb in the professional ladder, climb in the wage structure, and of course contribute more to the wealth of the country, the tax base, and at the end of the day retire with the opportunity to have a social security check and perhaps a good life.
I think one of the things that's also important to note is that, in the United States today, it's difficult to find workers. There's huge demand for workers that's not being met, and there's a significant number of U.S. citizens in Mexico willing to fill them, who don't need visas, who can go to the United States tomorrow and begin work. And so I think that there is an opportunity for the U.S. government to provide job trainings and skills trainings for people who are in Mexico that align with the demand for U.S. jobs. And so that's something that I think the consulates can also get involved in, maybe through a collaboration with the Department of Labor. There's certainly a huge need in the United States that needs to be met, and the number of U.S. workers outside the United States willing to take those jobs should be considered.
Thank you, Tony and Tran, for joining us on the podcast today to highlight this important issue. We really appreciate it.
Welcome back. Now we are welcoming Jeremy McKinney to the podcast. Jeremy is the current elected president of the American Immigration Lawyers Association, otherwise known as AILA. He is a board-certified immigration attorney practicing in Greensboro, North Carolina. His practice includes all aspects of immigration law and practice, including asylum, deportation defense, naturalization and citizenship, work and student visas, federal immigration litigation, and most relevant for today's theme, family-based green cards. So welcome to the podcast, Jeremy.
Thanks for having me, Teresa.
So there is a lot of Hollywoodization around green cards, and probably most Americans have some misconceptions about how the immigration system works. They may have seen movies like The Proposal or Green Card. We thought it might be fun to play a little Mythbusters and a little game of fact or fiction about marriage and immigration. So are you ready to play?
I am ready. Sounds fun.
All right, so let's get started. Getting a green card by marriage is the quickest and easiest way to get a green card. Fact or fiction?
That is mostly fiction. Now,
Okay.
The reason I didn't come in with a hard fact or fiction is that for a subset of cases, it might be the fastest and easiest way to become a resident of the United States. But for the vast majority, it is not.
Okay, so tell us a little bit like what is involved to get a green card by marriage, and where is that divide between mostly and not always, fastest and easiest?
Yeah. Okay. So basically, getting a residency through marriage doesn't require one thing, that is the marriage. It really requires three things. So number one is having that marriage. Now, we should never forget that marriage has to be bona fide and legitimate and not entered into for immigration purposes. Okay. But let's assume that. We got number one, a marriage to a U.S. citizen. Number two is venue. Where can I apply? Can I apply in the United States? Or will I have to apply abroad at a U.S. consulate in my home country? That is not an easy question. Or a simple question. For a lot of people, the answer is you can't do it here, you have to do it abroad. Then number three is, am I admissible? So for example, a person that is in the United States, if that person has been in the United States without permission, say for over 6 months, well, if they go abroad to get that appointment, they can't come back for many years. And so, again, it's not that easy. It's three things, and all three things have to work together in order for a marriage case to be a viable way to become a resident.
Okay. All right. So it's a little more complicated than it sounds. So let's go
touch.
to another one. Yeah, let's go to another one. So we already talked about this a little bit, but marrying an American citizen results in immediate citizenship for the foreign person. Fact or fiction?
Absolute fiction. That's an easy, clear-cut one.
Okay.
Because we are talking about paths to residency. I can tell you as an immigration attorney, whether it's a Democrat or Republican talking about a pathway to citizenship, a small part of my immigration lawyer soul dies. Because we're not talking about a pathway to citizenship. We are talking about a pathway to residency or a green card.
Okay. So green card allows somebody to live and work in the United States, but citizenship is a separate thing.
Correct. Permanent residents can't vote. Permanent residents can't serve on juries or get certain federal jobs. There are differences.
Yeah. But let's be clear. Getting a green card is almost always a precursor or a necessary precursor if you want to get citizenship, right?
Almost always. There's a big exception for military personnel serving during a time of war.
Right. Okay. All right. So let's move on here. So after getting married, the couple can just wait a while before they get a quick divorce and go their own ways, and the green card stays. Fact or fiction?
Also fiction. Also fiction. For a couple of reasons. I don't know how much in the weeds, but I will do my best. For the vast majority of marriage cases, a person does not become a full permanent resident immediately. The person becomes a conditional resident. That was something put into place by the George H.W. Bush administration years ago. And so you get a 2-year green card. And at the end of that 2 years, the resident basically has to demonstrate that the love boat is still sailing, or they have to apply for a waiver, which can be a complex and costly process.
All right.
And then in addition, if you have a quickie divorce and you're applying to become a U.S. citizen years later, that's going to probably come up.
Okay. So let's talk about something else though. Like if there was a divorce and say, the marriage was entered into, everybody loved each other up front, there was no fraud involved, but during the course they just decided it didn't work. Is it possible, you said there's a waiver, but is it possible for somebody to continue that process? And what are the things they would have to show to be able, or for example, an extreme condition, say the spouse dies before the waiver or before the conditions are lifted, or maybe there's spousal abuse. Can you talk about some of those particular characteristics?
Yes, there's 4 waivers available. First and foremost, after there's a final divorce, the applicant can make a showing that the marriage was entered into in good faith. And that's what most of these waivers involve, proving that the marriage was real. Number 2, you mentioned, that's abuse. If a person was subjected to abuse or extreme cruelty, that could be grounds for a waiver. Number 3 is a death. And that's, I think no explanation is necessary there. And number 4 is hardship. If an extreme hardship has arisen during the marriage, that could also be the basis for a waiver. And just a quick example for the last one, it's like, what does that look like? I had a client who was facing what he feared would be persecution or death if he was returned to his home country. Mm-hmm. And so instead of applying for asylum, I made that the foundation of his waiver application.
Okay. All right. So a divorce is not necessarily the end of the green card process, but you have to overcome some barriers to doing that. All right, cool. So let's go on. Government interviews for suspected marriage fraud include asking couples about the color of their spouse's toothbrush, what side of the bed they sleep on, the color of the curtains in the bedroom, or other details. Fact or fiction?
That is almost entirely fact. And let me clarify. Immigration tends to ask questions that have objective answers. So, for example, I've been practicing for 25 years. I've never had an immigration adjudicator ask, what is your partner's favorite food?
Okay.
Because that is a subjective. You would not ask that. What you would ask is, what was the last meal you ate together and what did you eat? Right? You see the difference there. It goes from subjective to objective. I get the what side of the bed do you sleep on question. I hear that a lot. Who sleeps closest to the door? Is there a bathroom adjoining the bedroom? Or do you subscribe? Do you have HBO? Asking about tattoos, especially in this day and age. Where do you have scars or tattoos or other markings? Objective questions.
Yeah. So they're basically trying to show or get proof that the couple is one cohabitating, right? That they're living together and sharing some sort of conjugal life.
Correct.
Let me ask kind of a touchy question. Do they get into the lovemaking habits of the couples often?
I have had that come up. The answer is apparently so. I've had it come up once. The more common question that I hear involves birth control, whether the couple uses any form of birth control to see if there's a match there.
Okay. So these questions can get a little.
Oh yeah, they can get sensitive, but even that question is rare. Usually the adjudicators, they don't want to turn it into an awkward situation either.
Yeah. So I've also heard tell that that when you're filing in these cases, the evidence that people submit can be like really thick, like including like their entire wedding photo album, or receipts from their honeymoon, or what kinds of things do you put in the filing to show that this was a bona fide real marriage?
Great question. So I try to encourage couples to avoid superfluous material. So have some representative photos, but not the entire album.
Okay.
If you have an album and you want to take it along to your interview, great. The officer might want to flip through it, but please don't make that part of your package. What I tell clients with regards to photos, my favorite photos are photos of the couple when they are not the focus of the photo. Because who's going to take their fake spouse to their cousin's graduation?
Gotcha.
Gotcha.
So you're in a big family photo with other people and you're off to the side.
Right.
And that's
my
less
favorite.
likely to be a staged one.
Right.
Gotcha.
Less likely to be a staged photo. That's what I like. In terms of documents, we start with housing and we go back from there. So is there a lease? Is there a deed? What bills are shared? Does the couple share a bank account? To be clear, the couple does not have to share a bank account. But if they do, then it's there. What I tell my clients is live your life. Do not manufacture evidence. You living your life day to day is going to create the evidentiary record. And the second you start forcing it is the moment that the marriage starts to look suspicious.
Gotcha. Okay, so let's look at our next question. So if a green card marriage is found to be fraudulent, both individuals can face serious consequences. Fact or fiction?
100% fact. 100% fact. So first of all, it is a federal felony. It's actually a couple of different federal felonies to provide false information in a sworn statement or on a form that you are swearing is true by penalty of perjury. It is also a crime to engage in marriage fraud itself. And what I often tell the U.S. citizen is, your spouse will get off easy. He or she will just get deported. But you could be charged and you could literally go to jail for this. So you need to think about that. That's part of that when you meet with a couple and you're trying to give them the real world speech because you're just meeting a couple for the first time. I need to know that the couple's in it to win it. And so I will talk about the ramifications of engaging in marriage fraud.
Yeah. So, I mean, I've heard from folks, and actually on this podcast, someone who's it works at Bipartisan Policy Center is on DACA was talking about, how her parents keep telling her, well, if you just marry somebody, then your situation will be taken care of. And she's like, well, not only do I think that's could be problematic, but I don't want the green card thing to be more important than my marriage, right? Like that's kind of one of those things that hovers over. Have you had that conversation with clients? Like maybe they're in a real relationship, but they're thinking maybe we should get married when we wouldn't necessarily would otherwise do it yet because of immigration. Like how do you weigh that? You have to be kind of part counselor as well as attorney, right?
Yes, absolutely. So number one, in a marriage case, most attorneys, including my law firm, engage in dual representation. You really represent the marriage. So if the marriage goes Splitville, then both parties have to get their own counsel because you're conflicted out of both cases. So making sure it's a partnership from day one is critical. I will not accept a marriage case unless I have met with both of my potential clients and not just one. And the conversation that I have with the foreign national is simple. You are giving all of the power for this period of time to the U.S. citizen.
Yeah.
Because
they're completely dependent on them to get that immigration status done.
Right. And so, if there are choices like a DACA recipient that wants to focus on life in the United States and not on getting married to finish out the process, I totally get that because it creates a really strange power dynamic at the beginning of this relationship. My favorite marriage cases are ones where the couple have been together for years and then suddenly, because of a change in the law or case law, they then become eligible to get their residency through that marriage.
Yeah. All right. So let's moving on because we kind of touched on this a little bit. If somebody is undocumented, marrying a citizen will automatically get them a green card. Fact or fiction?
Let me get you to repeat that.
Okay. If someone is in the United States and they're undocumented, if they marry a citizen, they automatically can get a green card.
False. That is fiction.
False. Okay.
And the reason is going back because a marriage case involves three things. And when you enter the United States without inspection, if you cross the border without a visa, for example, then you cannot generally, everything has exceptions, but generally cannot apply for your residency in the United States. You have to do it from abroad. And then regarding admissibility, if you actually leave and go abroad for that interview, it is highly likely that you're going to be barred from coming back in for a period of time ranging from 3 years to 10 years and potentially permanently. So it is a complex question. And in no way can an undocumented person simply marry a U.S. citizen and then become a resident.
All right. But is there a way? I mean, you mentioned if they leave, they have to go back. Are there waivers? Is there a narrow set of circumstances? Like it's not automatic for sure. But
correct.
Is there maybe a narrow set of circumstances where it's maybe possible?
Yes. There is a waiver available if the applicant can demonstrate that their U.S. citizen spouse or their parent, by the way, would suffer extreme hardship if the person's not permitted to return or return for that period of time, then a waiver is available. The problem is for many people, especially our Mexican friends, is that they don't have that one crossing, that they crossed one time and then never
probably
left.
had multiples, and that could be a permanent bar.
And that could be a permanent bar. And you cannot waive a permanent bar until you've left the U.S., left your community, left your children, etc., and stayed out for 10 years before applying for permission to come back in.
Yeah. So Yeah, not automatic, not simple, and very difficult. All right, one last fact or fiction. Same-sex couples can't get green cards based on their marriage. Fact or fiction?
Fortunately, now that is fiction.
All right, so you
thank-
say fortunately now. So it didn't used to be the case, but we can now. So what's changed?
A couple of different things, but one of them, by the way, used to be that homosexuality used to be a ground for exclusion into the United States.
Right, so our immigration laws made that a specific ground that would not let you come into the United States.
Correct. And then finally, with the Supreme Court knocking out prohibitions on same-sex marriages in states, now you have a situation where same-sex couples can get married in all 50 states in that or abroad, and that marriage is recognized in the United States.
Right. So the federal government, because of the Supreme Court case, now recognizes same-sex couples for all purposes, including for immigration.
Correct.
That's great. Well, that's our fact or fiction. But let me ask you, you've been practicing this for a long time. Do you have some really memorable cases of people that you were just so happy they came through this process, or that, that kind of stick out to your mind that you might want to share?
Yes, because when we talk about the beginning, the quickest or the fastest way, that's rarely a marriage case, but it often becomes the only way due to again a change in case law or a change in policy, and that's the most amazing feeling. You take someone that has lived with his or her U.S. citizen spouse for 2 decades and just really become an embedded part of this community, finally being able to pursue residency. The biggest population that's happened for lately, Teresa, are our TPS, or Temporary Protected Status recipients, because for the longest time they were in the United States without permission until they obtained their TPS status. And many, if not the vast majority, entered the United States without inspection because they were running away from really dangerous places into the United States. A change in the interpretation of the law has resulted in their temporary travel documents being considered admissions for applying for residency. And so again, it's complicated, right? Really complicated. Yeah. But the point is, you've got this little shift in policy that's resulted in people that have started families with and lived with U.S. citizens for years finally being able to become residents, and it's through that marriage. So there's look, family is 70% of American immigration law. It's really the bedrock foundational principle is that you immigrate to this country through family members. So marriage is a big part of that. I think a great point to this show today is just that, yes, it's a great part. It's foundational to U.S. immigration, but it's not quick and it's not easy.
It's not quick and it's not easy. Well, Jeremy McKinney, thank you so much for those insights, and thank you for sharing your expertise with us on This Week in Immigration.
Of course. Thanks. Have a great day.
And that's it for our show this week. One last reminder to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform, and share it with your friends and colleagues. You can also find more information on all of the issues we discuss here on the show at bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. You can follow the Bipartisan Policy Center on Twitter at BPC_bipartisan. You can follow Teresa Cardinal Brown at BPC_T Brown. I'm Hanadi Jordan. This Week in Immigration was created and executive produced by Teresa Cardinal Brown. This week's episode was written by Hanadi Jordan, Natalie Butler, and Teresa Cardinal Brown. The executive producer of BPC Podcast is Lucy Manning. See you next time on This Week in Immigration.